For more on this, we joined via Skype for more on this story by Dr. Reuben Loffman, a lecturer in African history at the Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Loffman, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, the DRC opposition parties meeting South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress. Can this produce the desired result?
It potentially could, but I think what's emerging from my position is two currents, which I think are potentially important here. I think the first current is South Africa obviously has a very important interest in making sure there are free and fair elections in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and is doing what I think behind the scenes to ensure that happens. However, the other important current that I think needs to be drawn to people's attention is the fact that South Africa wants to make sure that business works during this transition. And I think what it's doing is playing an interesting game, or at least he wants not necessarily to commit too early on to what's going to happen in the DRC. So, for example, if he is seen to be extremely supportive of the opposition, and I think that's increasingly looking like the case, if he's supportive of the opposition, it's obviously understandable. He doesn't want to necessarily alienate the PPRD, which is Kabila's party, because that party, of course, could produce the winner of the election. It's conceivable, although unlikely if there are free and fair elections, that Emmanuel Ramazani Shadari could win. And if Ramaphosa and the ANC are seen to back the opposition, that will create problems for the South Africa-DRC relationship going forward.
Dr. Loffman, we know that South Africa has always played a very constructive, or should I say, very influential role in the politics of the DRC. And now, given the current road to the December elections, which is often riddled and paved with potholes and dongas and uncertainty, can South Africa really play a role? And if so, what role can South Africa play in bringing about free and fair elections in the DRC?
That's a great question, and I think it can play a great deal of roles, to be honest. I think it's already doing so. You heard the minister earlier talking about the fact there are troops in South Africa which are keeping peace, specifically in eastern Congo, and they had a huge role to play, of course, in the security of the region following the M23 rebellion that happened relatively recently, a few years ago. So they have a tremendously important part to play in terms of stabilization and security while these elections are taking place. I think it's also that they have tremendous monetary to play. If you recall the 2011 elections in Congo, Jacob Zuma donated quite a bit of money to make sure that those elections legally happened. And so South Africa has a fiscal contribution to make. It has a military contribution to make in terms of security, but it also has a diplomatic function, as you know. I think it will be extremely important in terms of SADC, in terms of negotiating this transition. And again, coming back to my point about this, making sure that while the opposition are obviously heard, that Shadari is not necessarily alienated just in case he actually does get in. So the diplomatic cartwheels that South Africa will have to do as one of the main players of the SADC is going to be pretty important. So South Africa have an absolutely pivotal role to play here on a number of different fronts.
We know that some of the presidential candidates have been excluded from this race, and these are very, very popular candidates with the likes of Moise Katumbi, with the likes of Jean-Pierre Bemba. And for instance, the Congo Research Group has, they ran a poll placing him in third position of the most popular candidates. So what does this do with regards to the credibility of the elections?
Well, I think actually the credibility of the elections have taken a huge blow, and I think that that's expressed in the attitude of the opposition, who have written to an open letter really talking about some of the steps they feel should be taken immediately in order to try and at least make these free and fair. You correctly highlighted the fact that Jean-Pierre Bemba has been disallowed from running. We know, of course, as was earlier in your package, that Moise Katumbi has been unable to register as a candidate. So I think that is huge. And I think, to be honest, now it's looking like these elections cannot be free and fair without the candidacy of Bemba or of Katumbi. So I think already we're seeing problems. We've obviously seen clampdowns of activists leading up to these elections. So already I think the credibility of these elections are pretty badly affected. So I think a lot depends on the run-up to these elections, whether Felix Tshisekedi's campaign and the UDPS feel as though they are being allowed to campaign freely, and whether or not the opposition can unite behind him and are allowed to run a campaign which is free and fair, that might rescue some shred of credibility in this election. Although, of course, the counter-argument is always going to be, what if Bemba ran? As you correctly said, the Congo Research Group have polled that he was the top candidate. Likewise, Katumbe before him. So both the top candidates have been out of the running. So I think these elections are not going to be seen to be free and fair. The question is whether they can be fair enough.
Indeed, indeed, but that's the big question, perhaps. You recently argued that Joseph Kabila stepping aside would not necessarily change the political dynamics and the political machinations in the DRC. What do you mean by this, and do you still hold that view?
Well, I think it's a big thing. I think first and foremost, it is a big thing that Kabila has chosen to step down. He is the only president of the DRC in modern times who's done that. So that's something to be said. So that is a change to some degree. But what I meant by saying the power dynamics is really that if Shadari wins and if he uses unfair tactics to win, then of course the PPRD remain in power. And what I wrote was that there could be a Russia-type deal where we had Medvedev, of course, becoming president of Russia, Vladimir Putin becoming the prime minister, and of course they switch later on, and that's an arrangement that's still potentially feasible. So as much change as there could potentially be with Kabila stepping down, it could be, of course, just a temporary blip in the Kabila's grip on power. And so, of course, Shadari's main qualification for his candidacy at the PPRD, it strikes me as being loyalty. So I think that the structure of the Kabila regime has the potential, and I think very well could stay in place, despite, of course, the ostensible holding of elections. A lot depends, and I could be wrong, but a lot depends on whether Tshisekedi is able to campaign freely and fairly, because if he is, he could potentially break the Kabila stronghold. But I think and I fear that the PPRD and the Kabila regime will stay in power, albeit with a different figurehead.
Dr. Loffman, you've been keeping a very close eye on the on the political machinations in the DRC. So if you were given that opportunity to advise the leadership of that country on how they should, present a free and fair and a credible election, what would you say the current leadership should engage the opposition movement in order to address their concerns?
Well, I think first and foremost, there are a number of steps you can take. I mean, it's now very difficult because we're past the deadline for the registration of candidates. Before the 8th of August, I'd have said to you that you have to let Jean-Pierre Bemba run as a candidate for president. You have to let Moise Katumbe in the country and campaign to be president, or at least you have to be seen to give him a free and fair trial if you want to try him for the conviction that he's now received. You also need to make sure that the candidates can be seen to be running if there is no compelling legal case otherwise. Now we're past the 8th of August, we're past the deadline for appeal, and the list of candidates is going to appear tomorrow, I believe, which means, of course, if I was advising the government, what I'd like to advise is to let Bemba run and to let Katumbe back in the country and potentially run too. But that might be very tricky now. I think the most important advice that South Africa can give, coming back to South Africa, is to let Felix Tshisekedi campaign freely and fairly, to make sure that the opposition candidates as a whole can get behind him if they choose, or to get behind whichever candidate they wish, and to make sure that those campaigns are conducted freely and fairly without intimidation and without the arrest of political activists. I'd also say that there has to be some degree of investment in this process, and you have to let election monitors into the country, such as the UN envoy, have to let these people into the country in order to oversee this process. So half of my advice would be idealistic, I appreciate, but half of it is, I think, perfectly feasible with the letting Tshisekedi do whatever campaigning he feels he needs to do, and likewise, of course, letting envoys in.
Even though huge portions of the DRC are largely peaceful, but some parts in the northeastern parts of the country are in a state of conflict since the end of the Cold War. They've never enjoyed peace. They've never seen peace. So is there perhaps an end in sight?
It's a great question. I'm not entirely sure there's a great straightforward answer for you. What we're actually seeing is not a slowing down of violence. In fact, we could be seeing an acceleration. Not much has been reported on Kasai recently, but it's worth saying that violence doesn't look as though it's going away. You mentioned the northeast. That, in a sense, is looking like it's not going away either. We've got a patchwork of different rebel armies, and we've seen fiefdoms almost developing where there seems to be very little state presence, and what state presence there is often can play into dynamics of violence in eastern Congo. The situation in Ituri in the extreme northeast doesn't bear thinking about. So we have ADF rebels who have committed horrendous atrocities. And these are all very local, often very locally driven episodes of violence, but the state has in no way helped them, and in some ways has accelerated them. In terms of an end in sight, I think it's very difficult to say for sure when an end in sight could be. I think that the best thing that could happen really is for the state to try and maintain its, or to try and be legitimate. The holding of free and fair elections could go a long way, but their local dynamics are complicated and are perhaps worthy of a series of shows in and of themselves. But if there's an end in sight, I don't see it at the moment.